In matters of the heart, the head rarely gets a say. Writer Diane Schoemperlen chronicles her stormy 6-year relationship with Shane, a prison inmate serving a life sentence for second-degree murder, in her latest book, This Is Not My Life, a Memoir of Love, Prison, and Other Complications. Diane joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I guess one of the questions that I really wanted to ask you was, you've written 12 novels. This is your first memoir. Why?
Well, the 12 novels and short story collections, so they're not all novels. In this case, I felt it was important to write it as a memoir because although some of my fiction does have autobiographical elements, in this case I didn't want anybody to think I was making it up. Partly because a large part of what I wanted to do was to tell people about the Canadian prison system the way it actually is. Because I think a lot of what we think we know is actually based on American movies and TV. I also had quite a lot to say about the Harper government's tough on crime policies. So I was afraid that if and I could have turned it into a novel, I was afraid that if I did that, those parts of it would get lost.
We're going to talk more about the prison system in Canada, but writing it as a memoir, it's a topic, you fall in love with a man named Shane, which is not his real name,
right,
and he's a convicted murderer. The story itself, because I'm assuming there must be some kind of stigma with dating a convict,
sure,
but to tell it as a memoir, why do that?
Well, I guess because another part of what I wanted to do with the book was to break through some of the stereotypes, not only about prison as a physical place, but also about the inmates themselves and the staff and the women who fall in love with them, like me. There is a stigma, even in a prison town like Kingston. It's sort of not something everybody thinks, so what a good idea. And I guess part of me really wanted to not hide. I mean, I have this idea of that if a person is trying to make you feel bad about something that you're doing, you don't have to accept that. You don't have to take on the stigma.
It takes a while to get to that point, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does.
Yeah.
And, so for me, I felt that the best way to tell the story was as openly and honestly as I could.
So tell me about your life. What was your life like before you met Shane?
Well, I had a pretty quiet life as a writer. I spent a lot of time working at home by myself. I have been the single parent of a son from the beginning. At the time that I met Shane, my son Alex was 21. Right before I had met Shane, I had had yet another bad relationship. I haven't done really well in the relationship.
Hi,
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
You can't be good at everything. And so a friend of mine had convinced me to volunteer at this hot meal program in Kingston, which is where I met him. Basically, I have lived a pretty quiet life. I've been alone with my son for most of it. And writing has been always, since I was quite young, my big passion.
And so you were working with him at
Yes.
A volunteer position,
Right.
and for about a year?
Pretty much, yeah.
And then one day he gives you a note saying that he has feelings for you.
Yes.
Do you ever think that if he hadn't done that, would you have approached him?
I don't know. I'd never thought of that.
Yeah.
I'd actually never thought of that. Yeah. The thing that I really loved about all that is he wrote me this letter in which, he professed his love for me, and wouldn't it be great to have a romance? And then about 2 days later, I got another letter in which he took back everything he said in the first letter.
That's probably a warning of what's to come.
But what I really loved about it is that took place during the summer when we weren't seeing each other all the time at work because the hot meal program was closed for the summer. When we went back in the fall, and I had, given him the let's just be friends speech, I thought it would be so uncomfortable because nobody wants to hear that speech. But he was fine with it. And it didn't seem to have caused any problem at all. And I think in a way that was kind of when I really started to look at him closely as a person.
And what did you find out about him as a person?
What I found out about him is that he was very intelligent, he's an avid reader, huge, great sense of humor, deep thinking, thoughtful in that way of really thinking about things, all of which really, really appealed to me.
And what was he in prison for?
He was in prison for second-degree murder. He had actually started his prison sentence. By the time I met him, he'd been in prison for almost 30 years. He began his federal time in the mid to late 70s on a bank robbery, an armed robbery charge. And close to the end of that sentence, he had actually escaped and committed murder while he was unlawfully at large. And then, of course, ended up back in prison.
Now, you got to know him as a person before you knew what he had done. Were you surprised?
Yes, in fact, we were all surprised at the hot meal program because we assumed, well, for one thing, he came from a minimum security prison. And for another thing, the woman who used to bring him back and forth to
Was a nun?
was a like 85-year-old nun. So we thought, well, it couldn't, whatever he did, it couldn't have been that bad. And so the way we found out what he had done is that he was coming up for a parole hearing, and he asked some of us to have a look at his paperwork with the idea of writing a letter of support to the parole board. So I had already gotten to know him as a person, as you say, before I really understood what his actual crime was.
But you were still conflicted about dating him.
Well, yeah.
What did you tell yourself to make yourself okay with the fact that you were thinking about dating a murderer?
Yeah, I mean,
murder?
there's certainly, a lot of people have said, how do you fall in love with a murderer? Well, in effect, you do fall in love with a murderer the same way as you fall in love with anybody else. But there's a whole lot more to be thought about, and kind of arranging it all in your mind so that you can deal with it. And there's a section in the book which is kind of a series of questions that I asked myself. I mean, I knew I had feelings for him. He had been professing his love to me for ages. And they were questions about things that I would and wouldn't have been able to accept. His crime was what they call historical, meaning that it happened 30 years ago. If he had committed murder just 2 or 3 years before I met him, I don't think so. I don't think I would have gotten involved with him.
Why? Because it was more recent? Or?
More recent, I guess, in some way. I believed that we all change. And I knew the circumstances of the murder. I felt that, and I mean, I didn't condone it. When you're with someone who's committed a crime, this is part of the stigma, is people kind of assume that you are thinking, oh, well, never mind. But that's really not true. I mean, I sure wished he had never done such a thing.
And how did you two date?
Well, yeah, the whole dating thing is quite different. As I said in the book, you can't really call it going out with an inmate, because in fact, you're not really going out, you're going in. Although we did have a lot of time out in the community because he was out on work releases. But certainly, a large part of our relationship consisted of me going into prison to visit him.
And you also kind of kept it away from some of your friends and family?
Well, I didn't really keep it away. I mean, certainly everybody who's close to me, close friends in Kingston, knew. It was really certain people that I would run into kind of in a not personal way that sometimes I just couldn't be bothered to say. There's one part in the book where I was talking about one of my other books at a book club, which was a bunch of wealthy matrons, and we were having coffee afterwards, and I guess I had mentioned his name or said something about him a couple of times, and one of the women said, "Oh, what does your husband do?"
And then you said he works in corrections.
I didn't say works in. Yeah,
you said corrections.
I said he's with corrections.
Right, you're very ambiguous.
And I didn't really intend to do that, but to be perfectly honest, I didn't really like this group of women. And I thought, oh, I don't even want to. I could just imagine what the conversation was going to be. I thought,
but it's interesting because she assumed that he was,
of course
the front office or whatnot.
Yeah, I said he's with corrections, and she said, oh, well, that's a good job, because it is. And then she said, how long has he been with them? And I said, oh, about 30 years. Again, true. And then she said, oh, I guess he'll be getting ready to retire soon. I said, yeah, because in fact, he was on the brink of getting parole.
Out. Yeah.
So I wasn't exactly lying, but I was just avoiding an uncomfortable conversation.
And it's not nice to be judged, right?
Well, and you know, the truth of it is people are going to judge. I've come to the conclusion that, you know, that old saying of how there are only two things in life that you can be sure of, death and taxes. There's a third one, and that is judgment.
Yeah.
People are going to judge no matter what you do.
I have to write that down.
Yeah, write that down. Yeah.
So we talked earlier a little bit about Canada's prison system, and you said part of the reason for you to write this book was for us Canadians to get a better understanding of our prison system. So how would you characterize it?
Well, I mean, we work on what's called a graduated release system, meaning that there are 3 different main security levels: maximum, medium, and minimum. And the ideal thing that happens with someone, for instance, who has committed murder, they begin in the maximum security prison. And then over the years, if they do their programming and follow what's called their correctional plan and generally behave themselves and don't get into any more trouble inside, then they can be moved down to a medium security prison, and so on till they come to a minimum.
So when someone gets a life sentence, it doesn't mean that they'll be in maximum security for the...
It really is decided individually. There are some, of course, who are kind of in a separate category, I think, as far as criminals go. People like Paul Bernardo and Clifford Olson and Russell Williams are kind of in a separate category. Your regular, average, run-of-the-mill murderer is able to make his way down. They call it cascading down through the system, which is kind of a nice way of saying ending up in a minimum, which is the final step within the actual prison system before being given parole to move to a halfway house.
Okay. And in the book, too, you use the word institutionalized.
Yes.
What do you mean? What does that word mean?
Well, I mean, it's something that, a term that I had heard and I never really understood until kind of a bit too late for he and I in the first part of our relationship. But if you think about it, the way that a person lives inside prison is so completely different than it is out here. They're all grown-ups, but in a way they're treated like children. They are told when to go to bed, when they can eat, when they can shower, what they should wear, when they can speak to their loved ones on the phone, when they can have visitors. They don't have to, everything is laid out for them, what they can and cannot do. So they don't have the same kinds of life experiences that, with any luck, help the rest of us to sort of grow up and mature. And much as when anybody goes into prison, as you can imagine, they're kind of fighting against the whole idea of being incarcerated. But over time, it becomes how they live. So when they do get released, they're really not prepared for life out here in the so-called free world.
And you also, in the book, you mentioned, because the Harper government at the time cut some of the resources, and you had issue with that. Why?
Well, because I felt that one of the things, the main thing, was that what the Harper government were trying to do was to make prison more punitive and with less concern about A, the human rights of the prisoners, and B, what was going to happen when they got out. Because they didn't ever seem to consider that 99% of the people who are in prison right this minute are going to get out. So what's going to happen is all of these people are going to come out of prison into our communities, and the more resources the Harper government took away from them, cutting programs that were supposedly helping them when it came to that point, they're going to come out, they've got no money, they've got a criminal record, they can't get a job, maybe don't have a very good place to live because they haven't got a job. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to end up committing more crimes, and then that means there's going to be more victims. And a lot of the policies that the Harper government was putting into place actually are against the United Nations standards for the humane treatment of prisoners. We used to be known.
Like what?
Overcrowding, the size of the cells, putting 2 full-grown men into a cell that was like 50 square feet on a hot summer day, no air conditioning. I mean, it's against the United Nations standards and against Corrections Canada policies from earlier governments. So I really think that, you know, there are so many reasons why we should be paying more attention to what's happening in our prisons. The practical reason, as I said, there are kind of moral and ethical reasons. They are people. Everyone who is in there, they are people.
Now we have a new government in. How do you think the Trudeau government is handling this issue?
I feel hopeful. Yeah. I feel very hopeful. Trudeau did talk about these issues during the campaign. One of the big issues that I talk about in the book was the closing of the prison farms. And there has been...
Why were the farms important?
The farms were important because, for one thing, they provided employment for the inmates. And the therapeutic value of working with animals has long been documented. The fellows who worked on the farms with the cows, and I mean, they were learning an awful lot, not only about working with animals, working with each other, learning how to farm, learning how to run a farm.
And also growing their own food.
Yes, and another thing the Harper government never seemed to make much of was all the food that was produced in the prison farms was used to feed all the inmates in prison. So by cutting that, which was supposed to be an economic thing, in fact, it ended up, I'm sure, costing them more, because then they had to bring all the food in. So that's another thing that the Trudeau government has talked about, is the possibility of reopening the prison farms. The Supreme Court has already struck down 2 of the key measures of the Tough on Crime agenda, one of which was about mandatory minimums, and the other which was about credit for time served. So they are starting already to make some really important moves in returning the Canadian prison system back to what was actually known as a very humane and admirable prison system.
I want to bring the conversation back to you and Shane.
Okay.
The first time that you went to prison to visit him, what was that like?
Well, I was very curious. I mean, I had been, by that point, the nun who had been bringing him couldn't do it anymore because of health issues, so I had become his citizen escort. So I had been going to the prison to pick him up each morning and then taking him back there at the end of our workday, which was at about 2 o'clock. So I'd been a little way in to the prison. I had to go and sign for him and then sign him back over to them. But I was really, really curious, because I'm a curious person. I wanted to get in there further. And again, this was a time where I realized how much I thought I knew about prison came from movies.
Did anything surprise you
Totally.
or shock you?
The whole thing shocked me when I went in the first time, in a really good way. It was a big, beautiful, bright room filled with large square wooden tables with upholstered chairs. There was a microwave and a kettle. There were vending machines. There was a whole children's toy area with, you know, Talking Elmo and all these great toys. And it was not at all the picture that I had in my head. There were no, you know, those pictures, the scary looking guys in their orange jumpsuits talking to their visitors through glass on a metal telephone. And again, I must say, I only visited him in a minimum and a medium security prison. I had never been into any of the maximums, where I think they probably do have that. But again, the other thing is there's an outside visiting yard, which was like a park anywhere. There were picnic tables. Again, there was a children's play area. We played mini golf, you know.
Like normal couples.
Yeah.
So eventually Shane was on parole.
Yes.
And you lived together.
Yes.
How was that?
Well, that was the hard part. Before he got full parole and he came home to live with me, he also was given day parole to a halfway house in Peterborough. So then we had a year of kind of a long distance relationship, and that was very hard. But we both felt that once he got home to stay, then somehow everything would be better, because that pressure would be off. But in fact, everything was worse. And I didn't understand. I mean, looking back, I didn't understand how terrifying it was for him.
He was institutionalized, right?
He was completely institutionalized. I mean, for him, the way I can say it now is, even though he'd been coming out into the community and doing work releases and all of that, to be completely cut loose from the whole prison system and all that structure was as shocking and frightening for him as if you or I suddenly ended up being hauled off to prison tomorrow would be for us.
And how did that affect your writing?
Well, I didn't get very much writing done during all of this. I mean, I must say, it was kind of a full-time job having a relationship with him at all various stages of it. So that's the one thing.
So you were kind of in prison too.
Well, that's the one thing that I regret.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't regret the relationship. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret staying as long as I did. What I regret was all the time I lost in my writing. And I hope now to be able to just make up for lost time.
And there's a part in the memoir where you go to an event and you have this epiphany and you realize that you were in love with the story and not the reality of the situation.
Yeah. Yes, that was that. Sometimes, you know, you've I'm sure heard about reading the right book at exactly the right moment. Well, this was going to the exactly right literary event at the right moment, and it was Tim O'Brien, the American writer, was a keynote speaker for a conference at Humber that I had gone to, and I was already. I knew I had to end the relationship, but I just couldn't get there. And then I sat and listened to Tim O'Brien. The basic thing that he was talking about was how a story can save you and how reality is important, but sometimes it's not sufficient. I thought that was a great line. But I also realized that a story can also strangle you. And I was being strangled by the story that I had in my head of this relationship, when in fact the reality was completely unbearable.
What did Shane teach you about yourself?
Oh, that's a good question that nobody has asked me before.
Oh, what?
I think he taught me that I am a very accepting and compassionate person, which is a good thing to know about oneself. And that sometimes I can be so stubborn that I'm not paying attention to what's really happening. And I'm also a very romantic person, and I really wanted to believe through all of this that love can conquer all. Sadly, I have to say now it can't.
Where is Shane, and have you been in contact?
He is still in the halfway house in Ottawa, where he is at the end of the book. And yes, he has called me since the book came out. Of course, I was a little bit worried about how he might feel about it, but in fact, he really loves it. And that's been the best part of it for me, I think. And on the phone, he said, I understand that you wrote this out of love and pain. I thought, yep, you're exactly right.
I want to read a passage from your book.
Okay.
Sometimes I can come close to understanding why I stayed with him for almost 6 years, why I went back to him after everything fell apart, why I fell in love with him in the first place. Other times, it's as if it all happened to somebody else, somebody who looked just like me, lived in my house, slept in my bed, wore my clothes, and wrote my books. And where was I then? Where was I when all of this was going on? What insight have you gained since writing the book about everything that's happened?
Well, I got another big question. I think the title of this book, This Is Not My Life, is really significant for me, and I think for a lot of other people, is that sometimes there are some parts of your life where you really do feel like you're not yourself, that somehow things are just going on around you that can't possibly be your real life. And I guess maybe what I've learned in the broadest sense is that it is all your real life. And that although sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's painful, if you can get through it and feel like you've come out of it a better and stronger person, then it's all worth it.
I think we all have this perception that life is supposed to be like smooth and clean and perfect.
Yeah.
But even sometimes when it's messy, that's where you get all the good stuff.
Exactly. That's where you grow. That's where you learn. That's sometimes where you can just laugh and laugh. And as for that idea of the perfect life, do we know anybody who's really living that life? I can't think of a single person. And sometimes it is the people who seem to be living the perfect life who, when you find out what's really happening, they're not. So that I used to always think that, and there's a bit of that in the book, that I used to always sort of look at the people I knew and think that somehow their lives were much clearer and simpler and better than mine. And maybe that's the biggest thing I have learned, is that's not true for anybody. And for those of us who have had more complicated lives, we have nothing to be ashamed of.
And also regret. I always think that you can't regret something that you haven't done.
No.
And, you know, if you do something, even if it doesn't work out,
Yeah.
20 years from now, you're not going to say, oh, I shouldn't have done it.
Exactly.
You learn. Something always comes out of it anyway, for me.
Yeah, and for me as well. And certainly writing the book really helped me to understand that. It was a very difficult book to write, emotionally. But boy, oh boy, once I got to the end of it, I really felt like I had come to a much deeper understanding of him and of the relationship, and why, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it work.
And probably for yourself too, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for being here, Diane.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been great to talk to you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.